Hello everybody. So last week, I think it was last week, maybe the week before, I picked this book up, Existentialism and Humanism, John Paul Sartre. And apologies, I know these words are backwards. That was pointed out to me a couple of videos ago. It's because I used a selfie camera to do these videos. So easy enough to read, you just have to kind of read it backwards. Why did I pick up this book? Because John Paul Sartre comes up a lot in conversations with people, and he's mentioned a lot in the other books I read as well, about philosophy. His philosophy, existentialism, was based on Hegelian ideas, and it was based on a lot of the philosophers before him, German philosophers especially. But what was interesting about Sartre is he was the first one to really popularize existentialism. I'll go into what that is actually, existentialism, in a minute. I found the book fascinating. I found it very, very compelling reading that actually made me think a lot afterwards, and reflect on how I do things and how I see the world, which I think is what a good bit of philosophy should do for you. It should certainly make you think and possibly challenge the way you do things, the way you view things. That this book did both of those. It's a very short book because it's essentially just a transcription of a lecture he gave in Paris in 1945, and the date there is important because man is nothing but what he makes of himself. That is the first principle of existentialism. That's a quote from in there. And Jean Paul Sartre was really the first existentialist who was not Christian. So all of the Western philosophers beforehand were deeply rooted in Christianity, Catholicism, or whichever other form. And so there is actually a section in this lecture that he gives about God. What if God exists? Because Jean Paul Sartre starts off by talking about the need to explain existentialism and humanism, but I'm actually going to leave humanism out of this, just because for me this book was a brilliant introduction to existentialism. And one of the things that Jean Paul Sartre says is, although man is nothing but what he makes of himself, he is inevitably part of his epoch as well, part of the period of history within which he exists, or within which she exists. It doesn't have to be men. And one of the things about existentialism is it doesn't believe that it doesn't believe in fate. It doesn't believe that you are created wholly by the systems within which you live, although the period of history within which you live is important. And I think that's reflected because existentialism really took off under Jean Paul Sartre, and he was talking about it at the end of the Second World War. So people had seen what terrible things can happen as a result of doctrines, as a result of systems, maybe as a result of accepting externally imposed identities. If you're a German, you're going to be probably a Nazi, and therefore you're going to do these terrible things. And you can see that happening around the world now. There are countries within which the majority of the people are pretty much, because of the zeitgeist there, monsters, fascists, extreme fascists, murderers, whatever. So Jean Paul Sartre's thing was that isn't inevitable. Those terrible things which happened during World War II, they're not inevitable because each person makes themselves. There's no fate. There's no overriding system that creates you. That's one of the reasons I think it was so popular, and it's certainly been one of the philosophies, and he has been one of the philosophers to have the biggest impact on Western thought over the last century. Right now there seems to be a resurgence of interest in existentialism, and I think it's because the world's pretty much in the same shitty state it was in, certainly in terms of politics and belief systems before the Second World War. Although the Second World War is an interesting one to talk about because how the story is told now is not how it was played out back then. That's another video, that's another conversation. Some of the things that Jean Paul Sartre says in here, when he says because existentialism, when he talks about existentialism, because it's a new thing, a lot of people who are doing anything new who create a bit of attention, they say, oh yeah, I'm an existentialist, and therefore it creates confusion and it creates a bad name for existentialism. It's not the easiest thing to say. Um, so he decides it needs to be clearly defined what it is exactly. Um, and he talks about essence, the difference between essence and existence. What is that? So I was thinking about this and I've thought of an analogy, which I'll tell you in a second, but essence is an imbued purpose. So I think he explains it like this. He says if a watchmaker is making a watch, before that watch exists, it has a purpose, a defined use. Its existence is already chosen, so therefore it has an essence. So an essence might be like predetermined design or fate or purpose. Whereas humans don't. Humans exist first and then they create their own purpose. So I was thinking of it as maybe humans are like raindrops, because raindrops are nothing but the result of a chemical reaction. As are humans, if you view it like that. The difference between raindrops and humans is humans, once they're created, have a consciousness, so they can choose their path. They can assign meaning to things, but it's not assigned for them. It would be obviously by belief systems that they're introduced to, but ultimately the human chooses. One story that Sartre tells in here is about a young student who came to him because he was torn between going to war, where his brother had been killed, remember this at the end of the Second World War, and maybe avenging the death of his brother, or staying with his mother, who was so grief-stricken at losing her other son that losing him might kill her. So it was both about, one was about revenge and possibly saving many, many lives by defeating a terrible enemy and doing a good for a great many people, but that was a distant possibility. And the other option was about just impacting one life, saving one life, being with his mother who needed him. But that was almost a certainty. So he's weighing up the almost certain benefit of doing one thing with the potential benefit of doing many things that are good. That's a very interesting story that Jean-Paul Sartre comes back to illustrate a lot of things with. The other thing he says about God, even if God exists, so you don't have to be an atheist. It's more like being agnostic with existentialism. So even if God exists and decides everything, and there is fate, then there's nothing to lose by believing in him or not, because ultimately you have to make the choice. So existentialism isn't anti-God, nor is it pro-God. It just, you choose. You are responsible for your own fate. Also, it talks about potential. And potential is nothing. Potential is something that might be. All that matters is what you bring into existence, what actually is. Never mind about what you might do. That's irrelevant. Which kind of put a dampener on one of my other favourite quotes, which is actually by Mike Mentzer, and that's potential is nothing but the expression of a possibility. That is to say, there's no way of knowing. No, potential is nothing but the expression of a possibility. It can only be accurately assessed in retrospect. That is to say, there is no way of knowing how good you might have been unless you try. Whereas with existentialism, it's forget potential, that's all irrelevant, just see what you've actually done so far, and that's all that matters, that's the measure of you. Jean-Paul Sartre says that's actually extremely optimistic, it's not pessimistic. Many people criticized existentialism back then by saying, oh, it's terribly pessimistic. He said, no, it's the most optimistic thing, because it's not just thinking, it's actually doing things and creating things and putting no limit on yourself. There's so much to unpack here. It's a very, very good book. A very good speech. One of the great things about existentialism is, about Jean-Paul Sartre, is he was his own promoter. He wrote novels and stories and plays exploring the existentialist theme. So in that sense, he was fairly unique. I guess you might say that, Aristotle had done the same with stories of Socrates and everything, but not recently. So just to make you think differently, to give you a sort of it's all in my hands attitude, and also just as an introduction to possibly, no, almost certainly one of the most influential for Western thought, philosophies and modes of thinking in the last century. This is a brilliant introduction. Thoroughly recommend it. I'm going to give it a 10 out of 10. I'll probably read it again. So hope you enjoyed that. The book is Existentialism and Humanism. It's a translation of a speech he gave in 1945. And at the end, there's actually question and answer. So a lot of people asked him questions about it. He answered them, which helps to clarify some of the themes. I'll just read you the back before I go. Over the past 50 years, the writings of Jean-Paul Sartre have probably been more influential on the West than those of any other philosopher and literary figure. In his theoretical writings, Sartre laid the foundation for an original doctrine of existentialism. His concern, however, was to relate his theory to human response and the practical demands of living. To achieve this, he carried his philosophical concepts into his novels and plays, and there subjected them to the test of imagined experience. His uniqueness lies in the success with which he demonstrated the utility of existentialist doctrine, while creating at the same time works of the highest literary merit. Thus, Sartre became the popularizer of his own literary thought. Originally delivered as a lecture in Paris in 1945, Existentialism and Humanism is Jean-Paul Sartre's seminal defense of existentialism as a doctrine true to humanism as opposed to a purely nihilistic creed, and a plan for its practical application to everyday human life. This exploration of one of the central tenets of his philosophical thought has become the essential introduction to his work, and a fundamental text to all students of philosophy. Very good summary, I'd agree with all of that. So, yeah, this is getting a high rating. This is getting 10 out of 10. It's not a long book, very easy to read. Well, maybe not easy to read, but it won't take you a long time. So, check it out. Very good writing, very good stuff. Important to challenge and improve your thinking. And if you're into philosophy like I am, you'll love it. There you go.